Chapter 11 of The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 11. The Search for Stubbins. In a confused way, I was conscious that the skipper and the mates were down among us, trying to get us into some state of calmness. Eventually they succeeded, and we were able to go aft to the saloon door, which we did in a body. Here the skipper himself served out a large tot of rum to each of us. Then, at his orders, the second mate called the roll. He called over the mate's watch first, and everyone answered. Then he came to ours, and he must have been much agitated, for the first name he sung out was Jock's. Among us there came a moment of dead silence, and I noticed the wail and moan of the wind aloft, and the flap-flap of the three unfurled topgallantsails. The second mate called the next name hurriedly. "Jasket," he sung out. "Sir," Jasket answered. "Quoin." "Yes, sir." "Jessup." "Sir," I replied. "Stubbins." There was no answer. "Stubbins," again called the second mate. Again there was no reply. "Is Stubbins here? Anyone?" The second's voice sounded sharp and anxious. There was a moment's pause. Then one of the men spoke. "He's not here, sir." "Who saw him last?" the second asked. Plummer stepped forward into the light that streamed through the saloon doorway. He had on neither coat nor cap, and his shirt seemed to be hanging about him in tatters. "It were me, sir," he said. The old man, who was standing next to the second mate, took a pace towards him and stopped and stared. But it was the second who spoke. "Where?" he asked. "He were just above me, in their crosstrees, when—" The man broke off short. "Yes, yes," the second mate replied. Then he turned to the skipper. "Someone will have to go up, sir, and see." He hesitated. "But—" said the old man, and stopped. The second mate cut in. "I shall go up for one, sir," he said quietly. Then he turned back to the crowd of us. "Tammy," he sung out, "get a couple of lamps out of the lamp locker." "Aye, aye, sir," Tammy replied, and ran off. "Now," said the second mate, addressing us, "I want a couple of men to jump aloft with me and take a look for Stubbins." Not a man replied. I would have liked to step out and offer, but the memory of that horrible clutch was with me, and for the life of me I could not summon up the courage. "Come, come, men," he said. "We can't leave him up there. We shall take lanterns. Who'll come now?" I walked out to the front. I was in a horrible funk, but for very shame I could not stand back any longer. "I'll come with you, sir," I said, not very loud, and feeling fairly twisted up with nervousness. "That's more the tune, Jessup," he replied in a tone that made me glad I had stood out. At this point Tammy came up with the lights. He brought them to the second, who took one, and told him to give the other to me. The second mate held his light above his head and looked round at the hesitating men. "Now, men," he sung out, "you're not going to let Jessup and me go up alone. Come along, another one or two of you. Don't act like a damned lot of cowards." Quoin stood out and spoke for the crowd. "I dunno as we're acting like cowards, sir. But just look at him," and he pointed at Plummer, who still stood full in the light from the saloon doorway. "What sort of a thing is it as done that, sir?" he went on. "And then you arsks us ter go up again. It aren't likely as we're in a hurry." The second mate looked at Plummer, and surely, as I have before mentioned, the poor beggar was in a state. His ripped-up shirt was fairly flapping in the breeze that came through the doorway. The second looked, yet he said nothing. It was as though the realization of Plummer's condition had left him without a word more to say. It was Plummer himself who finally broke the silence. "I'll come with you, sir," he said. "Only yer ought to 'ave more light than them two lanterns. 'Twon't be no use unless we 'as plentier light." The man had grit, and I was astonished at his offering to go, after what he must have gone through. Yet I was to have even a greater astonishment, for abruptly the skipper, who all this time had scarcely spoken, stepped forward a pace, and put his hand on the second mate's shoulder. "I'll come with you, Mr. Tulipson," he said. The second mate twisted his head round and stared at him a moment in astonishment. Then he opened his mouth. "No, sir, I don't think—" he began. "That's sufficient, Mr. Tulipson," the old man interrupted. "I've made up my mind." He turned to the first mate, who had stood by without a word. "Mr. Grange," he said, "take a couple of the prentices down with you, and pass out a box of blue lights and some flare-ups." The mate answered something and hurried away into the saloon, with the two prentices in his watch. Then the old man spoke to the men. "Now, men," he began, "this is no time for dilly-dallying. The second mate and I will go aloft, and I want about half a dozen of you to come along with us and carry lights. Plummer and Jessup here have volunteered. I want 4 or 5 more of you. Step out now, some of you." There was no hesitation whatever now, and the first man to come forward was Coyne. After him followed 3 of the mate's crowd, and then old Jasket. That will do," said the old man. He turned to the second mate. "Has Mr. Grange come with those lights yet?" he asked with a certain irritability. "Here, sir," said the first mate's voice, behind him in the saloon doorway. He had the box of blue lights in his hands, and behind him came the 2 boys carrying the flares. The skipper took the box from him with a quick gesture and opened it. "Now, one of you men come here," he ordered. One of the men in the mate's watch ran to him. He took several of the lights from the box and handed them to the man. "See here," he said, "when we go aloft, you get into the foretop, and keep one of these going all the time. Do you hear?" "Yes, sir," replied the man. "You know how to strike them?" the skipper asked abruptly. "Yes, sir," he answered. The skipper sung out to the second mate. "Where's that boy of yours? Tammy, Mr. Tulipson." "Here, sir," said Tammy, answering for himself. The old man took another light from the box. "Listen to me, boy," he said. "Take this and stand by on the forward deck-house. When we go aloft, you must give us a light until the man gets his going in the top. You understand?" "Yes, sir," answered Tammy, and took the light. "1 minute," said the old man, and stooped and took a second light from the box. "Your first light may go out before we're ready. You'd better have another in case it does." Tammy took the second light and moved away. "Those flares are all ready for lighting there, Mr. Grange?" the captain asked. "All ready, sir," replied the mate. The old man pushed one of the blue lights into his coat pocket and stood upright. "Very well," he said. "Give each of the men 1 apiece, and just see that they all have matches." He spoke to the men particularly. "As soon as we are ready, the other 2 men in the mate's watch will get up into the crane lines and keep their flares going there. Take your paraffin tins with you. When we reach the upper topsail, Coyne and Jasket will get out on the yardarms and show their flares there. Be careful to keep your lights away from the sails. Plummer and Jessup will come up with the second mate and myself. Does every man clearly understand?" "Yes, sir," said the men in a chorus. A sudden idea seemed to occur to the skipper, and he turned and went through the doorway into the saloon. In about a minute he came back and handed something to the second mate that shone in the light from the lanterns. I saw that it was a revolver, and he held another in his hand, and this I saw him put into his side pocket. The second mate held the pistol a moment, looking a bit doubtful. "I don't think, sir," he began, but the skipper cut him short. "You don't know," he said. "Put it in your pocket." Then he turned to the first mate. "You will take charge of the deck, Mr. Grange, while we're aloft," he said. "Aye, aye, sir," the mate answered, and sung out to one of his prentices to take the blue light box back into the cabin. The old man turned and led the way forward. As we went, the light from the 2 lanterns shone upon the decks, showing the litter of the topgallant gear. The ropes were foul of one another in a regular bunch of buffers. This had been caused, I suppose, by the crowd trampling over them in their excitement when they reached the deck. And then, suddenly, as though the sight had waked me up to a more vivid comprehension, it came to me new and fresh how damned strange was the whole business. I got a little touch of despair, and asked myself what was going to be the end of all these beastly happenings. You can understand. Abruptly, I heard the skipper shouting away forward. He was singing out to Tammy to get up onto the house with his blue light. We reached the fore rigging, and the same instant the strange, ghastly flare of Tammy's blue light burst out into the night, causing every rope, sail, and spar to jump out weirdly. I saw now that the second mate was already in the starboard rigging with his lantern. He was shouting to Tammy to keep the drip from his light clear of the staysail, which was stowed upon the house. Then, from somewhere on the port side, I heard the skipper shout to us to hurry. "Smartly now, you men," he was saying. "Smartly now." The man who had been told to take up a station in the foretop was just behind the second mate. Plummer was a couple of ratlines lower. I caught the old man's voice again. "Where's Jessup with that other lantern?" I heard him shout. "Here, sir," I sung out. "Bring it over this side," he ordered. "You don't want the two lanterns on one side." I ran round the fore side of the house. Then I saw him. He was in the rigging, and making his way smartly aloft. One of the mate's watch and Quoin were with him. This I saw as I came round the house. Then I made a jump, gripped the sheer-pole, and swung myself up onto the rail. And then, all at once, Tammy's blue light went out, and there came, what seemed by contrast, pitchy darkness. I stood where I was, one foot on the rail and my knee upon the sheer-pole. The light from my lantern seemed no more than a sickly yellow glow against the gloom, and higher, some 40 or 50 feet, and a few ratlines below, the futtock rigging on the starboard side, there was another glow of yellowness in the night. Apart from these, all was blackness. And then from above, high above, there wailed down through the darkness a weird sobbing cry. What it was, I do not know, but it sounded horrible. The skipper's voice came down jerkily. "Smartly with that light, boy," he shouted. And the blue glare blazed out again, almost before he had finished speaking. I stared up at the skipper. He was standing where I had seen him before the light went out, and so were the two men. As I looked, he commenced to climb again. I glanced across to starboard. Jasket and the other man in the mate's watch were about midway between the deck of the house and the foretop. Their faces showed extraordinary pale in the dead glare of the blue light. Higher, I saw the second mate in the futtock rigging, holding his light up over the edge of the top. Then he went further and disappeared. The man with the blue lights followed, and also vanished from view. On the port side, and more directly above me, the skipper's feet were just stepping out of the futtock shrouds. At that I made haste to follow. Then suddenly, when I was close under the top, there came from above me the sharp flare of a blue light, and almost in the same instant Tammy's went out. I glanced down at the decks. They were filled with flickering, grotesque shadows cast by the dripping light above. A group of the men stood by the port galley door, their faces upturned and pale and unreal under the gleam of the light. Then I was in the futtock rigging, and a moment afterwards standing in the top beside the old man. He was shouting to the men who had gone out on the crane line. It seemed that the man on the port side was bungling. But at last, nearly a minute after the other man had lit his flare, he got going. In that time the man in the top had lit his second blue light, and we were ready to get into the topmast rigging. First, however, the skipper leant over the after side of the top and sung out to the first mate to send a man up onto the forecastle head with a flare. The mate replied, and then we started again, the old man leading. Fortunately, the rain had ceased, and there seemed to be no increase in the wind. Indeed, if anything, there appeared to be rather less. Yet what there was drove the flames of the flare-ups out into occasional twisting serpents of fire at least a yard long. About halfway up the topmast rigging, the second mate sung out to the skipper, to know whether Plummer should light his flare. But the old man said he had better wait until we reached the crosstrees, as then we could get out away from the gear to where there would be less danger of setting fire to anything. We neared the crosstrees, and the old man stopped and sung out to me to pass him the lantern by coin. A few ratlines more, and both he and the second mate stopped almost simultaneously, holding their lanterns as high as possible, and peered up into the darkness. "See any signs of him, Mr. Tulipson?" the old man asked. "No, sir," replied the second. "Not a sign." He raised his voice. "Stubbins!" he sung out. "Stubbins! Are you there?" We listened, but nothing came to us beyond the blowing moan of the wind, and the flap-flap of the bellying topgallant above. The second mate climbed over the crosstrees, and Plummer followed. The man got out by the royal backstay and lit his flare. By its light we could see plainly, but there was no vestige of Stubbins so far as the light went. "Get out on the yardarms with those flares, you two men," shouted the skipper. "Be smart now. Keep them away from the sail." The men got on to the foot-ropes, Quoin on the port and Jasket on the starboard side. By the light from Plummer's flare I could see them clearly, as they lay out upon the yard. It occurred to me that they went gingerly, which is no surprising thing. And then, as they drew near to the yardarms, they passed beyond the brilliance of the light, so that I could not see them clearly. A few seconds passed, and then the light from Quoin's flare streamed out upon the wind. Yet nearly a minute went by, and there was no sign of Jasket's. Then, out from the semi-darkness at the starboard yardarm, there came a curse from Jasket, followed almost immediately by a noise of something vibrating. "What's up?" shouted the second mate. "What's up, Jasket?" "It's the foot-rope, sir." He drew out the last word into a sort of gasp. The second mate bent quickly with the lantern. I craned round the after side of the topmast and looked. "What is the matter, Mr. Tulipson?" I heard the old man singing out. Out on the yardarm, Jasket began to shout for help, and then, all at once, in the light from the second mate's lantern, I saw that the starboard foot-rope on the upper topsail yard was being violently shaken. Savagely shaken is perhaps a better word. And then, almost in the same instant, the second mate shifted the lantern from his right to his left hand. He put the right into his pocket and brought out his gun with a jerk. He extended his hand and arm as though pointing at something a little below the yard. Then a quick flash spat out across the shadows, followed immediately by a sharp, ringing crack. In the same moment I saw that the foot-rope ceased to shake. "Light your flare! Light your flare, Jasket!" the second shouted. "Be smart now!" Out in the yardarm there came a splutter of a match, and then, straightaway, a great spurt of fire as the flare took light. "That's better, Jasket. You're all right now," the second mate called out to him. "What was it, Mr. Tulipson?" I heard the skipper ask. I looked up and saw that he had sprung across to where the second mate was standing. The second mate explained to him, but he did not speak loud enough for me to catch what he said. I had been struck by Jasket's attitude when the light of his flare had first revealed him. He had been crouched with his right knee cocked over the yard and his left leg down between it and the foot-rope, while his elbows had been crooked over the yard for support as he was lighting the flare. Now, however, he had slid both feet back onto the foot-rope, and was lying on his belly, over the yard, with the flare held a little below the head of the sail. It was thus, with the light being on the foreside of the sail, that I saw a small hole a little below the foot-rope, through which a ray of light shone. It was undoubtedly the hole which the bullet from the second mate's revolver had made in the sail. Then I heard the old man shouting to Jasket. "Be careful with that flare there," he sung out. You'll be having that sail scorched." He left the second mate and came back onto the port side of the mast. To my right, Plummer's flare seemed to be dwindling. I glanced up at his face through the smoke. He was paying no attention to it. Instead, he was staring up above his head. "Shove some paraffin onto it, Plummer," I called to him. "It'll be out in a minute." He looked down quickly to the light and did as I suggested. Then he held it out at arm's length and peered up again into the darkness. "See anything?" asked the old man, suddenly observing his attitude. Plummer glanced at him with a start. "It's the roiler, sir," he explained. "It's all adrift." "What?" said the old man. He was standing a few ratlines up the topgallant rigging, and he bent his body outwards to get a better look. "Mr. Tullipson," he shouted, "do you know that the royal's all adrift?" "No, sir," answered the second mate. "If it is, it's more of this devilish work." "It's adrift right enough," said the skipper, and he and the second went a few ratlines higher, keeping level with one another. I had now got above the crosstrees and was just at the old man's heels. Suddenly he shouted out, "There he is! Stubbins! Stubbins!" "Where, sir?" asked the second eagerly. "I can't see him." "There! There!" replied the skipper, pointing. I leant out from the rigging and looked up along his back in the direction his finger indicated. At first I could see nothing. Then slowly, there grew upon my sight a dim figure crouching upon the bunt of the royal, and partly hidden by the mast. I stared, and gradually it came to me that there was a couple of them, and further out upon the yard, a hump that might have been anything, and was only visible indistinctly amid the flutter of the canvas. "Stubbins!" the skipper sung out. "Stubbins! Come down out of that! Do you hear me?" But no one came, and there was no answer. "There's two," I began, but he was shouting again. "Come down out of that! Do you damned well hear me?" Still there was no reply. "I'm hanged if I can see him at all, sir," the second mate called out from his side of the mast. "Can't see him?" said the old man, now thoroughly angry. "I'll soon let you see him." He bent down to me with the lantern. "Catch hold, Jessup," he said, which I did. Then he pulled the blue light from his pocket, and as he was doing so I saw the second peek round the back side of the mast at him. Evidently, in the uncertain light, he must have mistaken the skipper's action, for all at once he shouted out in a frightened voice, "Don't shoot, sir! For God's sake, don't shoot!" "Shoot be damned!" exclaimed the old man. "Watch!" He pulled off the cap of the light. "There's two of them, sir," I called again to him. "What?" he said in a loud voice, and at the same instant he rubbed the end of the light across the cap, and it burst into fire. He held it up so that it lit the royal yard like day, and straightway a couple of shapes dropped silently from the royal onto the topgallant yard. At the same moment the humped something midway out upon the yard rose up. It ran into the mast, and I lost sight of it. "God!" I heard the skipper gasp, and he fumbled in his side pocket. I saw the two figures which had dropped onto the topgallant run swiftly along the yard, one to the starboard and the other to the port yardarms. On the other side of the mast the second mate's pistol cracked out twice sharply. Then from over my head the skipper fired twice, and then again, but with what effect I could not tell. Abruptly, as he fired his last shot, I was aware of an indistinct something gliding down the starboard royal backstay. It was descending full upon Plummer, who, all unconscious of the thing, was staring towards the topgallant yard. "Look out above you, Plummer!" I almost shrieked. "What? Where?" he called, and grabbed at the stay and waved his flare excitedly. Down on the upper topsail yard, Quoin's and Jaskett's voices rose simultaneously, and in the identical instant their flares went out. Then Plummer shouted, and his light went utterly. There were left only the 2 lanterns and the blue light held by the skipper, and that, a few seconds afterwards, finished and died out. The skipper and the second mate were shouting to the men upon the yard, and I heard them answer in shaky voices. Out on the crosstrees I could see, by the light from my lantern, that Plummer was holding in a dazed fashion to the backstay. "Are you all right, Plummer?" I called. "Yes," he said, after a little pause, and then he swore. "Come in off that yard, you men!" the skipper was singing out. "Come in! Come in!" Down on the deck I heard someone calling, but could not distinguish the words. Above me, pistol in hand, the skipper was glancing about uneasily. "Hold up that light, Jessup," he said. "I can't see." Below us the men got off the yard into the rigging. "Down on deck with you," ordered the old man. "As smartly as you can." "Coming off there, Plummer," sung out the second mate. "Get down with the others." "Down with you, Jessup," said the skipper, speaking rapidly. "Down with you." I got over the crosstrees, and he followed. On the other side the second mate was level with us. He had passed his lantern to Plummer, and I caught the glint of his revolver in his right hand. In this fashion we reached the top. The man who had been stationed there with the blue lights had gone. Afterwards I found that he went down on deck as soon as they were finished. There was no sign of the man with the flare on the starboard crane line. He also, I learnt later, had slid down one of the backstays onto the deck only a very short while before we reached the top. He swore that a great black shadow of a man had come suddenly upon him from aloft. When I heard that, I remembered the thing I had seen descending upon Plummer. Yet the man who had gone out on the port crane line, the one who had bungled with the lighting of his flare, was still where we had left him, though his light was burning now but dimly. "Come in out of that, you!" the old man sung out. "Smartly now, and get down on deck." "Aye, aye, sir," the man replied, and started to make his way in. The skipper waited until we had got into the main rigging, and then he told me to get down out of the top. He was in the act of following, when, all at once, there rose a loud outcry on deck, and then came the sound of a man screaming. "Get out of my way, Jessup!" the skipper roared, and swung himself down alongside of me. I heard the second mate shout something from the starboard rigging. Then we were all racing down as hard as we could go. I had caught a momentary glimpse of a man running from the doorway on the port side of the forecastle. In less than half a minute we were upon the deck, and among a crowd of the men who were grouped round something. Yet, strangely enough, they were not looking at the thing among them, but away aft at something in the darkness. "It's on the rail!" cried several voices. "Overboard!" called somebody, in an excited voice. "It's jumped over the side!" "There weren't nothin'," said a man in the crowd. "Silence!" shouted the old man. "Where's the mate? What's happened?" "Here, sir," called the first mate shakily from near the center of the group. "It's Jacob, sir. He... "What?" said the skipper. "What?" He's dead, I think," said the first mate in jerks. "Let me see," said the old man in a quieter tone. The men had stood to one side to give him room, and he knelt beside the man upon the deck. "Pass the lantern here, Jessup," he said. I stood by him and held the light. The man was lying face downwards on the deck. Under the light from the lantern the skipper turned him over and looked at him. "Yes," he said after a short examination. "He's dead." He stood up and regarded the body a moment in silence. Then he turned to the second mate, who had been standing by during the last couple of minutes. "3," he said in a grim undertone. The second mate nodded and cleared his voice. He seemed on the point of saying something. Then he turned and looked at Jacobs and said nothing. "3," repeated the old man. "Since 8 bells." He stooped and looked again at Jacobs. poor devil," he muttered. The second mate grunted some of the huskiness out of his throat and spoke. "Where must we take him?" he asked quietly. "The 2 bunks are full." "You'll have to put him down on the deck by the lower bunk," replied the skipper. As they carried him away, I heard the old man make a sound that was almost a groan. The rest of the men had gone forward, and I do not think he realized that I was standing by him. "My God, oh my God," he muttered, and began to walk slowly aft. He had cause enough for groaning. There were 3 dead, and Stubbins had gone utterly and completely. We never saw him again. End of chapter 11. Of the Ghost Pirates, by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 12. The Council. A few minutes later, the second mate came forward again. I was still standing near the rigging, holding the lantern, in an aimless sort of way. "That you, Plummer?" he asked. "No, sir," I said. "It's Jessup." "Where's Plummer, then?" he inquired. "I don't know, sir," I answered. "I expect he's gone forward. Shall I go and tell him you want him?" "No, there's no need," he said. "Tie your lamp up in the rigging, on the sheer pole there, then go and get his, and shove it up on the starboard side. After that, you better go aft and give the 2 prentices a hand in the lamp locker." "Aye, aye, sir," I replied, and proceeded to do as he directed. After I had got the light from Plummer and lashed it up to the starboard sherpole, I hurried aft. I found Tammy and the other prentice in our watch, busy in the locker lighting lamps. "What are we doing?" I asked. "The old man's given orders to lash all the spare lamps we can find in the rigging so as to have the decks light," said Tammy. "And a damn good job, too." He handed me a couple of the lamps and took 2 himself. "Come on," he said, and stepped out on deck. "We'll fix these in the main rigging, and then I want to talk to you." "What about the mizzen?" I inquired. "Oh," he replied, "he," meaning the other prentice, "will see to that. Anyway, it'll be daylight directly." We shoved the lamps up on the sherpoles, 2 on each side. Then he came across to me. "Look here, Jessup," he said, without any hesitation. "You'll have to jolly well tell the skipper and the second mate all you know about this." "How do you mean?" I asked. "Why, that it's something about the ship herself that's the cause of what's happened," he replied. "If you'd only explained to the second mate when I told you to, this might never have been." "But I don't know," I said. "I may be all wrong. It's only an idea of mine. I have no proofs." "Proofs!" he cut in with. "Proofs! What about tonight? We've had all the proofs ever I want." I hesitated before answering him. "So have I, for that matter," I said at length. "What I mean is, I've nothing that the skipper and the second mate would consider as proofs. They'd never listen seriously to me." "They'd listen fast enough," he replied. "After what's happened this watch, they'd listen to anything. Anyway, it's jolly well your duty to tell them." "What could they do, anyway?" I said despondently. "As things are going, we'll all be dead before another week is over at this rate." "You tell them," he answered. "That's what you've got to do. If you can only get them to realize that you're right, they'll be glad to put into the nearest port and send us all ashore." I shook my head. "Well, anyway, they'll have to do something," he replied in answer to my gesture. "We can't go round the Horn with the number of men we've lost. We haven't enough to handle her if it comes on to blow." "You've forgotten, Tammy," I said. "Even if I could get the old man to believe I'd gotten at the truth of the matter, he couldn't do anything. Don't you see, if I'm right, we couldn't even see the land, if we made it. We're like blind men." "What on earth do you mean?" he interrupted. "How do you make out we're like blind men? Of course we could see the land." Wait a minute, I said. "You don't understand. Didn't I tell you?" "Tell what?" he asked. "About the ship I spotted," I said. "I thought you knew." "No," he said. "When?" "Why," I replied, "you know when the old man sent me away from the wheel?" "Yes," he answered. "You mean in the morning watch, day before yesterday?" "Yes," I said. "Well, don't you know what was the matter?" "No," he replied. "That is, I heard you were snoozing at the wheel, and the old man came up and caught you." "That's all a darn silly yarn," I said, and then I told him the whole truth of the affair. After I had done that, I explained my idea about it to him. "Now you see what I mean?" I asked. "You mean that this strange atmosphere, or whatever it is we're in, would not allow us to see another ship?" he asked, a bit awestruck. "Yes," I said. "But the point I wanted you to see is that if we can't see another vessel, even when she's quite close, then, in the same way, we shouldn't be able to see land. To all intents and purposes, we're blind. Just you think of it. We're out in the middle of the briny, doing a sort of eternal blind man's hop. The old man couldn't put into port even if he wanted to. He'd run us bang on shore without our ever seeing it." "What are we to do, then?" he asked in a despairing sort of way. "Do you mean to say we can't do anything? Surely something can be done. It's terrible." For perhaps a minute we walked up and down in the light from the different lanterns. Then he spoke again. "We might be run down then," he said, "and never even see the other vessel?" "It's possible," I replied, "though from what I saw it's evident that we're quite visible, so that it would be easy for them to see us and steer clear of us, even though we couldn't see them." "And we might run into something and never see it?" he asked me, following up the train of thought. "Yes," I said, "only there's nothing to stop the other ship from getting out of our way." "But if it wasn't a vessel," he persisted, "it might be an iceberg, or a rock, or even a derelict." "In that case," I said, putting it a bit flippantly, naturally, "we'd probably damage it." He made no answer to this, and for a few moments we were quiet. Then he spoke abruptly, as though the idea had come suddenly to him. "Those lights the other night," he said, "were they a ship's lights?" "Yes," I replied. "Why?" "Why," he answered, "don't you see, if they were really lights, we could see them?" "Well, I should think I ought to know that," I replied. "You seem to forget that the second mate slung me off the lookout for daring to do that very thing." "I don't mean that," he said. "Don't you see that if we could see them at all, it showed that the atmosphere thing wasn't round us then?" "Not necessarily," I answered. "It may have been nothing more than a rift in it, though of course I may be all wrong. But anyway, the fact that the lights disappeared almost as soon as they were seen shows that it was very much round the ship." That made him feel a bit the way I did, and when next he spoke his tone had lost its hopefulness. "Then you think it'll be no use telling the second mate and the skipper anything?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied. "I've been thinking about it, and it can't do any harm. I've a very good mind to." "I should," he said. "You needn't be afraid of anybody laughing at you now. It might do some good. You've seen more than anyone else." He stopped in his walk and looked round. "Wait a minute," he said, and ran aft a few steps. I saw him look up at the break of the poop. Then he came back. "Come along now," he said. "The old man's up on the poop, talking to the second mate. You'll never get a better chance." Still I hesitated, but he caught me by the sleeve and almost dragged me to the lee ladder. "All right," I said, when I got there. "All right, I'll come. Only I'm hanged if I know what to say when I get there." "Just tell them you want to speak to them," he said. "They'll ask you what you want, and then you spit out all you know. They'll find it interesting enough." "You'd better come too," I suggested. "You'll be able to back me up in lots of things." "I'll come fast enough," he replied. "You go up." I went up the ladder and walked across to where the skipper and the second mate stood talking earnestly by the rail. Tammy kept behind. As I came near to them, I caught 2 or 3 words, though I attached no meaning then to them. They were, "Send for him." And then the 2 of them turned and looked at me, and the second mate asked what I wanted. "I want to speak to you and the old captain, sir," I answered. "What is it, Jessup?" the skipper inquired. "I scarcely know how to put it, sir," I said. It's about these things." "What things? Speak out, man," he said. "Well, sir," I blurted out, "there's some dreadful thing or things come aboard this ship since we left port." I saw him give one quick glance at the second mate, and the second looked back. Then the skipper replied. "How do you mean, come aboard?" he asked. "Out of the sea, sir," I said. "I've seen them. So's Tammy here." "Ah!" he exclaimed, and it seemed to me from his face that he was understanding something better. "Out of the sea!" Again he looked at the second mate, but the second was staring at me. "Yes, sir," I said. "It's the ship. She's not safe. I've watched. I think I understand a bit, but there's a lot I don't." I stopped. The skipper had turned to the second mate. The second nodded gravely. Then I heard him mutter in a low voice, and the old man replied, after which he turned to me again. "Look here, Jessup," he said, "I'm going to talk straight to you. You strike me as being a cut above the ordinary shellback, and I think you've sense enough to hold your tongue." "I've got my mate's ticket, sir," I said simply. Behind me I heard Tammy give a little start. He had not known about it until then. The skipper nodded. "So much the better," he answered. "I may have to speak to you about that later on." He paused, and the second mate said something to him in an undertone. "Yes," he said, as though in reply to what the second had been saying. Then he spoke to me again. "You've seen things come out of the sea, you say?" he questioned. "Now just tell me all you can remember, from the very beginning." I set to and told him everything in detail, commencing with the strange figure that had stepped aboard out of the sea, and continuing my yarn up to the things that had happened in that very watch. I stuck well to solid facts, and now and then he and the second mate would look at one another and nod. At the end he turned to me with an abrupt gesture. "You still hold, then, that you saw a ship the other morning when I sent you from the wheel?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "I most certainly do." "But you knew there wasn't any?" he said. "Yes, sir," I replied in an apologetic tone. "There was, and if you will let me, I believe that I can explain it a bit." "Well," he said, "go on." Now that I knew he was willing to listen to me in a serious manner, all my funk of telling him had gone, and I went ahead and told him my ideas about the mist and the thing it seemed to have ushered, you know. I finished up by telling him how Tammy had worried me to come and tell what I knew. "He thought then, sir," I went on, "that you might wish to put in to the nearest port, but I told him that I didn't think you could, even if you wanted to." "How's that?" he asked, profoundly interested. "Well, sir," I replied, "if we're unable to see other vessels, we shouldn't be able to see the land. You'd be piling the ship up without ever seeing where you are putting her." This view of the matter affected the old man in an extraordinary manner, as it did, I believe, the second mate, and neither spoke for a moment. Then the skipper burst out. "By Gad, Jessup," he said, "if you're right, the Lord have mercy on us." He thought for a couple of seconds, then he spoke again, and I could see that he was pretty well twisted up. "My God, if you're right." The second mate spoke. "The men mustn't know, sir," he warned him. "It'd be a mess if they did." "Yes," said the old man. He spoke to me. "Remember that, Jessup," he said. "Whatever you do, don't go yarning about this forward." "No, sir," I replied. "And you too, boy," said the skipper. "Keep your tongue between your teeth. We're in a bad enough mess without your making it worse. Do you hear?" "Yes, sir," answered Tammy. The old man turned to me again. "These things, or creatures, that you say come out of the sea," he said. "You've never seen them except after nightfall?" he asked. "No, sir," I replied. "Never." He turned to the second mate. "So far as I can make out, Mr. Tillotson," he remarked, "the danger seems to be only at night." "It's always been at night, sir," the second answered. The old man nodded. "Have you anything to propose, Mr. Tulipson?" he asked. "Well, sir," replied the second mate, "I think you ought to have her snugged down every night before dark." He spoke with considerable emphasis. Then he glanced aloft and jerked his head in the direction of the unfurled topgallants. "It's a damn good thing, sir," he said, "that it didn't come on to blow any harder." The old man nodded again. "Yes," he remarked, "we shall have to do it, but God knows when we'll get home." "Better late than not at all," I heard the second mutter under his breath. Out loud he said, "And the light, sir?" "Yes," said the old man. "I will have lamps in the rigging every night after dark." "Very good, sir," assented the second. Then he turned to us. "It's getting daylight, Jessup," he remarked with a glance at the sky. "You'd better take Tammy with you, and shove those lamps back again into the locker." "Aye, aye, sir," I said, and went down off the poop with Tammy. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 13. The Shadow in the Sea. When 8 bells went at 4 o'clock, and the other watch came on deck to relieve us, it had been broad daylight for some time. Before we went below, the second mate had the 3 topgallants set, and now that it was light, we were pretty cautious to have a look aloft, especially up the fore. And Tom, who had been up to overhaul the gear, was questioned a lot, when he came down, as to whether there were any signs of anything queer up there. But he told us there was nothing unusual to be seen. At 8 o'clock, when we came on deck for the 8 to 12 watch, I saw the sailmaker coming forward along the deck, from the second mate's old berth. He had his rule in his hand, and I knew he had been measuring the poor beggars in there, for their burial outfit. From breakfast time until near noon he worked, shaping out 3 canvas wrappers from some old sailcloth. Then, with the aid of the second mate and one of the hands, he brought out the 3 dead chaps on to the after-hatch, and there sewed them up, with a few lumps of holy stone at their feet. He was just finishing when 8 bells went, and I heard the old man tell the second mate to call all hands aft for the burial. This was done, and one of the gangways unshipped. We had no decent grating big enough, so they had to get off one of the hatches and use it instead. The wind had died away during the morning, and the sea was almost a calm, the ship lifting ever so slightly to an occasional glassy heave. The only sounds that struck on the ear were the soft, slow rustle and occasional shiver of the sails, and the continuous and monotonous creak of the spars and gear at the gentle movements of the vessel. And it was in this solemn half-quietness that the skipper read the burial service. They had put the Dutchman first upon the hatch. I could tell him by his stumpiness, and when at last the old man gave the signal, the second mate tilted his end, and he slid off and down into the dark. "Poor old Dutchy," I heard one of the men say, and I fancy we all felt a bit like that. Then they lifted Jacobs onto the hatch, and when he had gone, Jock. When Jock was lifted, a sort of sudden shiver ran through the crowd. He had been a favourite in a quiet way, and I know I felt, all at once, just a bit queer. I was standing by the rail upon the after bollard, and Tammy was next to me, while Plummer stood a little behind. As the second mate tilted the hatch for the last time, a little hoarse chorus broke from the men. "So long, Jock. So long, Jock." And then at the sudden plunge they rushed to the side to see the last of him as he went downwards. Even the second mate was not able to resist this universal feeling, and he too peered over. From where I had been standing, I had been able to see the body take the water, and now, for a brief couple of seconds, I saw the white of the canvas, blurred by the blue of the water, dwindle and dwindle in the extreme depth. Abruptly, as I stared, it disappeared, too abruptly it seemed to me. "Gone," I heard several voices say, and then our watch began to go slowly forward, while one or two of the other started to replace the hatch. Tammy pointed and nudged me. "See, Jessup," he said. "What is it?" "What?" I asked. "That queer shadow," he replied. "Look." And then I saw what he meant. It was something big and shadowy, that appeared to be growing clearer. It occupied the exact place, so it seemed to me, in which Jock had disappeared. "Look at it," said Tammy again. "It's getting bigger." He was pretty excited, and so was I. As I peered down, the thing seemed to be rising out of the depths. It was taking shape. As I realized what the shape was, a queer, cold funk took me. "See," said Tammy, "it's just like the shadow of a ship." And it was. The shadow of a ship rising out of the unexplored immensity beneath our keel. Plummer, who had not yet gone forward, caught Tammy's last remark and glanced over. "What's he mean?" he asked. "That," replied Tammy, and pointed. I jabbed my elbow into his ribs, but it was too late. Plummer had seen. Curiously enough, though, he seemed to think nothing of it. "That ain't nothin', 'cept the shadow of the ship," he said. Tammy, after my hint, let it go at that. But when Plummer had gone forward with the others, I told him not to go telling everything round the decks like that. "We've got to be thundering careful," I remarked. "You know what the old man said last watch?" "Yes," said Tammy. "I wasn't thinking. I'll be careful next time." A little way from me the second mate was still staring down into the water. I turned and spoke to him. "What do you make it out to be, sir?" I asked. "God knows," he said, with a quick glance round to see whether any of the men were about. He got down from the rail and turned to go up onto the poop. At the top of the ladder he leant over the break. "You may as well ship that gangway, you two," he told us. "And mind, Jessup, keep your mouth shut about this." "Aye, aye, sir," I answered. "And you too, youngster," he added, and went aft along the poop. Tammy and I were busy with the gangway when the second came back. He had brought the skipper. "Right under the gangway, sir," I heard the second say, and he pointed down into the water. For a little while the old man stared. Then I heard him speak. "I don't see anything," he said. At that the second mate bent more forward and peered down. So did I. But the thing, whatever it was, had gone completely. "It's gone, sir," said the second. "It was there right enough when I came for you." About a minute later, having finished shipping the gangway, I was going forward, when the second's voice called me back. "Tell the captain what it was you saw just now," he said in a low voice. "I can't say exactly, sir," I replied, "but it seemed to me like the shadow of a ship, rising up through the water." "There, sir," remarked the second mate to the old man, "just what I told you." The skipper stared at me. "You're quite sure?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I answered. "Tammy saw it too." I waited a minute. Then they turned to go aft. The second was saying something. "Can I go, sir?" I asked. "Yes, that will do, Jessup," he said over his shoulder. But the old man came back to the break and spoke to me. "Remember, not a word of this forward," he said. "No, sir," I replied, and he went back to the second mate, while I walked forward to the forecastle to get something to eat. "You're waxing the kettle, Jessup," said Tom as I stepped in over the washboard. "And I got your lime juice in a pannikin." "Thanks," I said, and sat down. As I stowed away my grub, I took no notice of the chatter of the others. I was too stuffed with my own thoughts. That shadow of a vessel rising, you know, out of the profound deeps, had impressed me tremendously. It had not been imagination. 3 of us had seen it. Really 4, for Plummer distinctly saw it, though he failed to recognize it as anything extraordinary. As you can understand, I thought a lot about this shadow of a vessel. But, I am sure, for a time my ideas must have gone in an everlasting blind circle. And then I got another thought, for I got thinking of the figures I had seen aloft in the early morning, and I began to imagine fresh things. You see, that first thing that had come up over the side had come out of the sea, and it had gone back. And now there was this shadow vessel thing, Ghost ship, I called it. It was a damned good name, too. And the dark, noiseless men. I thought a lot on these lines. Unconsciously, I put a question to myself aloud. Were they the crew? "Eh?" said Jasket, who was on the next chest. I took hold of myself, as it were, and glanced at him in an apparently careless manner. "Did I speak?" I asked. "Yes, mate," he replied, eyeing me curiously. "You said something about a crew." "I must have been dreaming," I said, and rose up to put away my plate. End of chapter 13. Of the Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 14. The Ghost Ships. At 4 o'clock, when again we went on deck, the second mate told me to go on with a paunch mat I was making, while Tammy he sent to get out his sinnet. I had the mat slung on the fore side of the mainmast, between it and the after end of the house. And in a few minutes Tammy brought his sinnet and yarns to the mast, and made fast to one of the pins. "What do you think it was, Jessup?" he asked abruptly after a short silence. I looked at him. "What do you think?" I replied. "I don't know what to think," he said, "but I've a feeling that it's something to do with all the rest," and he indicated aloft with his head. "I've been thinking too," I remarked. "That it is?" he inquired. "Yes," I answered, and told him how the idea had come to me at my dinner, that the strange men-shadows which came aboard might come from that indistinct vessel we had seen down in the sea. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, as he got my meaning. And then for a little he stood and thought. "That's where they live, you mean," he said at last, and paused again. "Well," I replied, "it can't be the sort of existence we should call life." He nodded doubtfully. "No," he said, and was silent again. Presently he put out an idea that had come to him. "You think, then, that vessel has been with us for some time, if we'd only known?" he asked. "All along," I replied. "I mean, ever since these things started." "Supposing there are others?" he said suddenly. I looked at him. "If there are," I said, "you can pray to God that they won't stumble across us. It strikes me that whether they're ghosts or not ghosts, they're blood-gutted pirates." "It seems horrible," he said solemnly, "to be talking seriously like this, about, you know, about such things." "I've tried to stop thinking that way," I told him. "I felt I should go cracked if I didn't. There's damned queer things happen at sea, I know, but this isn't one of them." "It seems so strange and unreal one moment, doesn't it?" he said, "and the next you know it's really true, and you can't understand why you didn't always know. And yet they'd never believe if you told them ashore about it." "They'd believe if they'd been in this packet in the middle watch this morning," I said. "Besides," I went on, "they don't understand. We didn't. I shall always feel different now, when I read that some packet hasn't been heard of." Tammy stared at me. "I've heard some of the old shellbacks talking about things," he said, "but I never took them really seriously." "Well," I said, "I guess we'll have to take this seriously. I wish to God we were home." "My God, so do I," he said. For a good while after that we both worked on in silence, but presently he went off on another tack. "Do you think we'll really shorten her down every night before it gets dark?" he asked. "Certainly," I replied. "They'll never get the men to go aloft at night, after what's happened." But, supposing they ordered us aloft," he began. "Would you go?" I interrupted. "No," he said emphatically. "I'd jolly well be put in irons first." "That settles it, then," I replied. You wouldn't go, nor would anyone else." At this moment the second mate came along. "Shove that mat and that sennit away, you two," he said. "Then get your brooms and clear up." "Aye, aye, sir," we said, and he went on forward. "Jump on the house, Tammy," I said, "and let go the other end of this rope, will you?" "Right," he said, and did as I asked him. When he came back, I got him to give me a hand to roll up the mat, which was a very large one. "I'll finish stopping it," I said. "You go and put your sennit away." "Wait a minute," he replied, and gathered up a double handful of shakens from the deck, under where I had been working. Then he ran to the side. "Here," I said, "don't go dumping those. They'll only float, and the second mate or the skipper will be sure to spot them." "Come here, Jessup," he interrupted in a low voice, and taking no notice of what I had been saying. I got up off the hatch where I was kneeling. He was staring over the side. "What's up?" I asked. "For God's sake, hurry," he said, and I ran and jumped onto the spar alongside of him. "Look," he said, and pointed with a handful of shakens right down directly beneath us. Some of the shakens dropped from his hand and blurred the water momentarily so that I could not see. Then, as the ripples cleared away, I saw what he meant. "Two of them," he said in a voice that was scarcely above a whisper. "And there's another out there," and he pointed again with the handful of shakens. "There's another a little further aft," I muttered. "Where? Where?" he asked. "There," I said, and pointed. "That's four," he whispered. "4 of them." I said nothing, but continued to stare. They appeared to me to be a great way down in the sea, and quite motionless. Yet, though their outlines were somewhat blurred and indistinct, there was no mistaking that they were very like exact, though shadowy representations of vessels. For some minutes we watched them, without speaking. At last Tammy spoke. "They're real, right enough," he said in a low voice. "I don't know," I answered. "I mean, we weren't mistaken this morning," he said. "No," I replied. "I never thought we were." Away forward I heard the second mate returning aft. He came nearer and saw us. "What's up now, you two?" he called sharply. "This isn't clearing up." I put out my hand to warn him not to shout, and draw the attention of the rest of the men. He took several steps towards me. "What is it? What is it?" he said with a certain irritability, but in a lower voice. "You better take a look over the side, sir," I replied. My tone must have given him an inkling that we had discovered something fresh. For at my words he made one spring and stood on the spar alongside me. "Look, sir," said Tammy. "There's 4 of them." The second mate glanced down, saw something, and bent sharply forward. "My God," I heard him mutter under his breath. After that, for some half-minute he stared, without a word. "There are 2 more out there, sir," I told him, and indicated the place with my finger. It was a little time before he managed to locate these, and when he did, he gave them only a short glance. Then he got down off the spar and spoke to us. "Come down off there," he said quickly. "Get your brooms and clear up. Don't say a word. It may be nothing." He appeared to add that last bit as an afterthought, and we both knew it meant nothing. Then he turned and went swiftly aft. "I expect he's gone to tell the old man," Tammy remarked as we went forward, carrying the mat and his sennit. I said, scarcely noticing what he was saying, for I was full of the thought of those 4 shadowy craft waiting quietly down there. We got our brooms and went aft. On the way the second mate and the skipper passed us. They went forward too by the fore-brace and got up on the spar. I saw the second point up at the brace, and he appeared to be saying something about the gear. I guessed that this was done purposely to act as a blind, should any of the men be looking. Then the old man glanced down over the side in a casual sort of manner. So did the second mate. A minute or 2 later they came aft and went back up onto the poop. I caught a glimpse of the skipper's face as he passed me on his return. He struck me as looking worried. Bewildered, perhaps, would be a better word. Both Tammy and I were tremendously keen to have another look, but when at last we got a chance, the sky reflected so much on the water we could see nothing below. We had just finished sweeping up when 4 bells went, and we cleared below for tea. Some of the men got chatting while they were grubbing. "I have heard," remarked Quoin, "as we're going to shorten her down afore dark." "Eh?" said old Jaskett over his pannikin of tea. Quoin repeated his remark. "Who says so?" inquired Plummer. "I heard it from the dock," answered Quoin. "He got it from the steward." "How would he know?" asked Plummer. "I dunno," said Quoin. "I 'spect he's heard him talkin' about it arft." Plummer turned to me. "Have you heard anything, Jessup?" he inquired. "What, about shortening down?" I replied. "Yes," he said. "Weren't the old man talkin' to you up on their poop this mornin'?" "Yes," I answered. "He said something to the second mate about shortening down, but it wasn't to me." "They are," said Quoin. "Haven't I just said so?" At that instant one of the chaps in the other watch poked his head in through the starboard doorway. "All hands shorten sail," he sung out. At the same moment the mate's whistle came sharp along the decks. Plummer stood up and reached for his cap. "Well," he said, "it's evident they ain't going to lose no more of us." Then he went out on deck. It was a dead calm, but all the same we furled the 3 royals and then the 3 topgallants. After that we hauled up the main and foresail and stowed them. The crossjack, of course, had been furled some time, with the wind being plumb aft. It was while we were up at the foresail that the sun went over the edge of the horizon. We had finished stowing the sail out upon the yard, and I was waiting for the others to clear in, and let me get off the foot-rope. Thus it happened that, having nothing to do for nearly a minute, I stood watching the sunset, and so saw something that otherwise I should most probably have missed. The sun had dipped nearly halfway below the horizon and was showing like a great red dome of dull fire. Abruptly, far away on the starboard bow, a faint mist drove up out of the sea. It spread across the face of the sun so that its light shone now as though it came through a dim haze of smoke. Quickly this mist or haze grew thicker, but at the same time separating and taking strange shapes, so that the red of the sun struck through ruddily between them. Then, as I watched, the weird mistiness collected and shaped and rose into 3 towers. These became more definite, and there was something elongated beneath them. The shaping and forming continued, and almost suddenly I saw that the thing had taken on the shape of a great ship. Directly afterwards I saw that it was moving. It had been broadside to the sun. Now it was swinging. The bows came round with a stately movement, until the 3 masts bore in a line. It was heading directly toward us. It grew larger, but yet less distinct. Astern of it, I saw now that the sun had sunk to a mere line of light. Then, in the gathering dusk, it seemed to me that the ship was sinking back into the ocean. The sun went beneath the sea, and the thing I had seen became merged, as it were, into the monotonous greyness of the coming night. A voice came to me from the rigging. It was the second mate's. He had been up to give us a hand. "Now then, Jessup," he was saying, "come along, come along." I turned quickly and realized that the fellows were nearly all off the yard. "Aye, aye, sir," I muttered, and slid in along the foot-rope and went down on deck. I felt fresh, dazed and frightened. A little later 8 bells went, and, after roll call, I cleared up onto the poop to relieve the wheel. For a while as I stood at the wheel my mind seemed blank, and incapable of receiving impressions. This sensation went after a time, and I realized that there was a great stillness over the sea. There was absolutely no wind, and even the everlasting creak, creak of the gear seemed to ease off at times. At the wheel there was nothing whatever to do. I might just as well have been forward, smoking in the forecastle. Down on the main deck I could see the loom of the lanterns that had been lashed up to the sherpoles in the fore and main rigging. Yet they showed less than they might, owing to the fact that they had been shaded on their aftersides so as not to blind the officer of the watch more than need be. The night had come down strangely dark, and yet of the dark and the stillness and the lanterns I was only conscious in occasional flashes of comprehension. For now that my mind was working, I was thinking chiefly of that queer, vast phantom of mist I had seen rise from the sea and take shape. I kept staring into the night towards the west, and then all round me. For naturally the memory predominated that she had been coming towards us when the darkness came, and it was a pretty disquieting sort of thing to think about. I had such a horrible feeling that something beastly was going to happen any minute. Yet 2 bells came and went, and still all was quiet. Strangely quiet, it seemed to me. And of course, besides the queer, misty vessel I had seen in the west, I was all the time remembering the 4 shadowy craft lying down in the sea, under our port side. Every time I remembered them, I felt thankful for the lanterns round the main deck, and I wondered why none had been put in the mizzen rigging. I wished to goodness that they had, and made up my mind I would speak to the second mate about it next time he came aft. At the time he was leaning over the rail across the break of the poop. He was not smoking, as I could tell, for had he been, I should have seen the glow of his pipe now and then. It was plain to me that he was uneasy. 3 times already he had been down onto the main deck, prowling about. I guessed that he had been to look down into the sea for any signs of those 4 grim craft. I wondered whether they would be visible at night. Suddenly the timekeeper struck 3 bells, and the deeper notes of the bell forward answered them. I gave a start. It seemed to me that they had been struck close to my elbow. There was something unaccountably strange in the air that night. Then, even as the second mate answered the lookouts all well, there came the sharp whir and rattle of running gear on the port side of the mainmast. Simultaneously there was the shrieking of a peril up the main, and I knew that someone, or something, had let go the main topsail halyards. From aloft there came the sound of something parting, then the crash of the yard as it ceased falling. The second mate shouted out something unintelligible and jumped for the ladder. From the main deck there came the sound of running feet and the voices of the watch shouting. Then I caught the skipper's voice. He must have run out on deck through the saloon doorway. "Get some more lamps! Get some more lamps!" he was singing out. Then he swore. He sung out something further. I caught the last 2 words. "Carried away," they sounded like. "No, sir," shouted the second mate. "I don't think so." A minute of some confusion followed, and then came the click of pawls. I could tell that they had taken the halyards to the after capstan. Odd words floated up to me. "All this water?" I heard in the old man's voice. He appeared to be asking a question. "Can't say, sir," came the second mate's. There was a period of time, filled only by the clicking of the pawls and the sounds of the creaking parrel and the running gear. Then the second mate's voice came again. "Seems all right, sir," I heard him say. I never heard the old man's reply, for in the same moment there came to me a chill of cold breath at my back. I turned sharply and saw something peering over the taffrail. It had eyes that reflected the binnacle light, weirdly, with a frightful tigerish gleam. But beyond that I could see nothing with any distinctness. For the moment I just stared. I seemed frozen. It was so close. Then movement came to me, and I jumped to the binnacle and snatched out the lamp. I twitched round and shone the light towards it. The thing, whatever it was, had come more forward over the rail. But now, before the light, it recoiled with a queer, horrible litheness. It slid back and down, and so out of sight. I have only a confused notion of a wet glistening something with two vile eyes. Then I was running, crazy, towards the break of the poop. I sprang down the ladder and missed my footing and landed on my stern at the bottom. In my left hand I held the still burning binnacle lamp. The men were putting away the capstan bars, but at my abrupt appearance, and the yell I gave out at falling, one or two of them fairly ran backwards a short distance in sheer funk before they realized what it was. From somewhere further forward, the old man and the second mate came running aft. "What the devil's up now?" sung out the second, stopping and bending to stare at me. "What's to do that you're away from the wheel?" I stood up and tried to answer him, but I was so shaken that I could only stammer. There," I stuttered. "Damnation!" shouted the second mate angrily. "Get back to the wheel!" I hesitated and tried to explain. "Do you damned well hear me?" he sung out. "Yes, sir, but—" I began. "Get up onto the poop, Jessup," he said. I went. I meant to explain when he came up. At the top of the ladder I stopped. I was not going back alone to that wheel. Down below I heard the old man speaking. "What on earth is it now, Mr. Tulipson?" he was saying. The second mate made no immediate reply, but turned to the men, who were evidently crowding near. "That will do, men," he said somewhat sharply. I heard the watch start to go forward. There came a mutter of talk from them. Then the second mate answered the old man. He could not have known that I was near enough to overhear him. "It's Jessup, sir. He must have seen something, but we mustn't frighten the crowd more than need be." "No," said the skipper's voice. They turned and came up the ladder, and I ran back a few steps as far as the skylight. I heard the old man speak as they came up. "How is it there are no lamps, Mr. Tulipson?" he said in a surprised tone. "I thought there would be no need up here, sir," the second mate replied. Then he added something about saving oil. "Better have them, I think," I heard the skipper say. "Very good, sir," answered the second, and sung out to the timekeeper to bring up a couple of lamps. Then the two of them walked aft to where I stood by the skylight. "What are you doing away from the wheel?" asked the old man in a stern voice. I had collected my wits somewhat by now. "I won't go, sir, till there's a light," I said. The skipper stamped his foot angrily, but the second mate stepped forward. "Come, come, Jessup," he exclaimed. "This won't do, you know. You'd better get back to the wheel without further bother." "Wait a minute," said the skipper at this juncture. "What objection have you to going back to the wheel?" he asked. "I saw something," I said. "It was climbing over the taffrail, sir." "Ah," he said, interrupting me with a quick gesture. Then abruptly, sit down, sit down. You're all in a shake, man." I flopped down on the skylight seat. I was, as he had said, all in a shake, and the binnacle lamp was wobbling in my hand, so that the light from it went dancing here and there across the deck. "Now," he went on, "just tell us what you saw." I told them at length, and while I was doing so the timekeeper brought up the lights and lashed one up on the sheer pole in each rigging. "Shove one under the spanker boom," the old man sung out as the boy finished lashing up the other two. "Be smart now." "Aye, aye, sir," said the prentice, and hurried off. "Now then," remarked the skipper when this had been done, "you needn't be afraid to go back to the wheel. There's a light over the stern, and the second mate or myself will be up here all the time." I stood up. "Thank you, sir," I said, and went aft. I replaced my lamp in the binnacle and took hold of the wheel. Yet, time and again, I glanced behind, and I was very thankful when, a few minutes later, 4 bells went and I was relieved. Though the rest of the chaps were forward in the forecastle, I did not go there. I shirked being questioned about my sudden appearance at the foot of the poop ladder, so I lit my pipe and wandered about the main deck. I did not feel particularly nervous, as there were now 2 lanterns in each rigging, and a couple standing upon each of the spare topmasts under the bulwarks. Yet, a little after 5 bells, it seemed to me that I saw a shadowy face peer over the rail, a little abaft of the fore lanyards. I snatched up one of the lanterns from off the spar and flashed the light towards it, whereupon there was nothing. Only, on my mind, more than my sight I fancy, a queer knowledge remained of wet, peery eyes. Afterwards, when I thought about them, I felt extra beastly. I knew then how brutal they had been. Inscrutable, you know. Once more in that same watch, I had a somewhat similar experience, only in this instance it had vanished even before I had time to reach a light. And then came 8 bells, and our watch below. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 15. The Great Ghost Ship. When we were called again, at 3:45, the man who roused us out had some queer information. "Toppin's gone. Clean vanished," he told us, as we began to turn out. "I never was in such a damned hair-raisin' hooker as this here. It ain't safe to go about the bloomin' decks." "'Oo's gone?" asked Plummer, sitting up suddenly and throwing his legs over his bunk-board. "Toppin, one of the 'prentices," replied the man. "We've been huntin' all over the bloomin' show. We're still at it, but we'll never find him," he ended, with a sort of gloomy assurance. "Oh, I dunno," said Quoin. "Perhaps he's snoozin' somewheres 'bout." "Not him," replied the man. "I tell you, we've turned everything upside down. He's not aboard the bloomin' ship." "Where was he when they last saw him?" I asked. "Someone must know something, you know." "Keepin' time up on the poop," he replied. "The old man's nearly shook the life out of the mate and the chap at the wheel, and they say they don't know nothin'." "How do you mean?" I inquired. "How do you mean, nothing?" "Well," he answered, "the youngster was there one minute, and the next thing they knew he'd gone. They've both sworn black and blue that there wasn't a whisper. He's just disappeared off the face of the bloomin' earth." I got down onto my chest and reached for my boots. Before I could speak again, the man was saying something fresh. "See here, mates," he went on, "if things is goin' on like this, I'd like to know where you and me'll be before long." "We'll be in hell," said Plummer. "I dunno as I like to think 'bout it," said Quoin. "We'll have to think about it," replied the man. "We've got to think a bloomin' lot about it. I've talked to our side, and they're game." "Game for what?" I asked. "To go and talk straight to the bloomin' captain," he said, wagging his finger at me. "It's make tracks for the nearest bloomin' port, and don't you make no bloomin' mistake." I opened my mouth to tell him that the probability was we should not be able to make it, even if he could get the old man to see the matter from his point of view. Then I remembered that the chap had no idea of the things I had seen and thought out. So instead I said, "Supposing he won't?" "Then we'll have to bloomin' well make him," he replied. "And when you got there," I said, "what then? You'd be jolly well locked up for mutiny." "I'd sooner be locked up," he said. "It don't kill you." There was a murmur of agreement from the others, and then a moment of silence, in which, I know, the men were thinking. Jaskett's voice broke into it. "I never thought at first as she was 'aunted," he commented, but Plummer cut in across his speech. "We mustn't hurt anyone, you know," he said. "That'd mean hangin', and they ain't been a bad crowd." "No," assented everyone, including the chap who had come to call us. "All the same," he added, "it's got to be up Pelham, and shove her into the nearest bloomin' port." "Yes," said everyone, then 8 bells went, and we cleared out on deck. Presently, after roll call, in which there had come a queer, awkward little pause at Toppin's name, Tammy came over to me. The rest of the men had gone forward, and I guessed they were talking over mad plans for forcing the skipper's hand and making him put into port. Poor beggars. I was leaning over the port rail, by the fore bracelock, staring down into the sea, when Tammy came to me. For perhaps a minute he said nothing. When at last he spoke, it was to say that the shadow vessels had not been there since daylight. "What?" I said in some surprise. "How do you know?" "I woke up when they were searching for Toppin," he replied. "I've not been asleep since. I came here right away." He began to say something further, but stopped short. "Yes?" I said encouragingly. "I didn't know—" he began and broke off. He caught my arm. "Oh, Jessup," he exclaimed, "what's going to be the end of it all? Surely something can be done." I said nothing. I had a desperate feeling that there was very little we could do to help ourselves. "Can't we do something?" he asked, and shook my arm. "Anything's better than this. We're being murdered." Still I said nothing, but stared moodily down into the water. I could plan nothing, though I would get mad, feverish fits of thinking. "Do you hear?" he said. He was almost crying. "Yes, Tammy," I replied, "but I don't know. I don't know." "You don't know?" he exclaimed. "You don't know? Do you mean we're just to give in and be murdered, one after another?" "We've done all we can," I replied. "I don't know what else we can do, unless we go below and lock ourselves in every night." "That would be better than this," he said. "There'll be no one to go below, or anything else soon." "But what if it came on to blow?" I asked. "We'd be having the sticks blown out of her." "What if it came on to blow now?" he returned. "No one would go aloft. If it were dark, you said yourself. Besides, we could shorten her right down, first. I tell you, in a few days there won't be a chap alive aboard this packet unless they jolly well do something." "Don't shout," I warned him. "You'll have the old man hearing you." But the young beggar was wound up and would take no notice. "I will shout," he replied. "I want the old man to hear. I've a good mind to go up and tell him." He started on a fresh tack. "Why don't the men do something?" he began. "They ought to damn well make the old man put us into port. They ought—" "For goodness sake, shut up, you little fool," I said. "What's the good of talking a lot of damned rot like that? You'll be getting yourself into trouble." "I don't care," he replied. "I'm not going to be murdered." "Look here," I said. "I told you before that we shouldn't be able to see the land even if we made it." "You've no proof," he answered. "It's only your idea." "Well," I replied, "proof or no proof, the skipper would only pile her up if he tried to make the land, with things as they are now." "Let him pile her up," he answered. "Let him jolly well pile her up. That would be better than staying out here to be pulled overboard or chucked down from aloft." "Look here, Tammy," I began, but just then the second mate sung out for him and he had to go. When he came back I had started to walk to and from across the fore side of the mainmast. He joined me, and after a minute he started his wild talk again. "Look here, Tammy," I said once more. "It's no use your talking like you've been doing. Things are as they are, and it's no one's fault, and nobody can help it. If you want to talk sensibly, I'll listen. If not, then go and gas to someone else." With that I returned to the port side and got up on the spar again, intending to sit on the pin-rail and have a bit of a talk with him. Before sitting down I glanced over into the sea. The action had been almost mechanical. Yet, after a few instants, I was in a state of the most intense excitement, and without withdrawing my gaze, I reached out and caught Tammy's arm to attract his attention. "My God," I muttered. "Look." "What is it?" he asked, and bent over the rail beside me. And this is what we saw. A little distance below the surface there lay a pale-colored, slightly domed disk. It seemed only a few feet down. Below it we saw quite clearly, after a few moments staring, the shadow of a royal yard, and deeper the gear and standing rigging of a great mast. Far down among the shadows I thought presently that I could make out the immense, indefinite stretch of vast decks. "My God!" whispered Tammy, and shut up. But presently he gave out a short exclamation, as though an idea had come to him, and got down off the spar and ran forward onto the forecastle head. He came running back after a short look into the sea to tell me that there was the truck of another great mast coming up there, a bit off the bow to within a few feet of the surface of the sea. In the meantime, I had been staring like mad down through the water at the huge, shadowy mast just below me. I had traced out bit by bit until now I could clearly see the jackstay running along the top of the royal-mast. And, the royal itself was set. But, what was getting at me more than anything was a feeling that there was movement down in the water there among the rigging. I thought I could actually see, at times, things moving and glinting faintly and rapidly to and fro in the gear. And once I was practically certain that something was on the royal yard, moving into the mast, as though, it might have come up the leach of the sail. And this way I got a beastly feeling that there were things swarming down there. Unconsciously, I must have leant further and further out over the side, staring. And suddenly, good Lord, how I yelled! I overbalanced. I made a sweeping grab and caught the forebrace, and with that I was back in a moment upon the spar. In the same second almost, it seemed to me that the surface of the water above the submerged truck was broken, and I am sure now I saw something a moment in the air against the ship's side, a sort of shadow in the air, though I did not realize it at the time. Anyway, the next instant Tammy gave out an awful scream and was head downwards over the rail in a second. I had an idea then that he was jumping overboard. I collared him by the waist of his breeches and one knee, and then I had him down on the deck and sat plump on him, for he was struggling and shouting all the time, and I was so breathless and shaken and gone to mush I could not have trusted my hands to hold him. You see, I never thought then it was anything but some influence at work on him, and that he was trying to get loose to go over the side. But I know now that I saw the shadow man that had him. Only at the time I was so mixed up, and with the one idea in my head, I was not really able to notice anything properly. But afterwards I comprehended a bit, you can understand, can't you, what I had seen at the time without taking in. And even now, looking back, I know that the shadow was only like a faint seen greyness in the daylight, against the whiteness of the decks, clinging against Tammy. And there was I, all breathless and sweating and quivering with my own tumble, sitting on the little screeching beggar, and he fighting like a mad thing, so that I thought I should never hold him. And then I heard the second mate shouting, and there came running feet along the deck. Then many hands were pulling and hauling to get me off him. "Blooding coward!" sung out someone. "Hold him! Hold him!" I shouted. "He'll be overboard!" At that they seemed to understand that I was not ill-treating the youngster, for they stopped manhandling me and allowed me to rise, while two of them took hold of Tammy and kept him safe. "What's the matter with him?" the second mate was singing out. "What's happened?" "He has gone off his head, I think," I said. "What?" asked the second mate. But before I could answer him, Tammy ceased suddenly to struggle, and flopped down upon the deck. "He's fainted," said Plummer with some sympathy. He looked at me with a puzzled, suspicious air. "What's happened? What's he been doing?" "Take him aft into the berth," ordered the second mate a bit abruptly. It struck me that he wished to prevent questions. He must have tumbled to the fact that we had seen something, about which it would be better not to tell the crowd. Plummer stooped to lift the boy. "No," said the second mate. "Not you, Plummer. Jessup, you take him." He turned to the rest of the men. "That will do," he told them, and they went forward, muttering a little. I lifted the boy and carried him aft. "No need to take him into the berth," said the second mate. "Put him down on the after hatch. I've sent the other lad for some brandy." Then the brandy came, we dosed Tammy, and soon brought him round. He sat up with a somewhat dazed air. Otherwise, he seemed quiet and sane enough. "What's up?" he asked. He caught sight of the second mate. "Have I been ill, sir?" he exclaimed. "You're right enough now, youngster," said the second mate. "You've been a bit off. You'd better go and lie down for a bit." "I'm all right now, sir," replied Tammy. "I don't think—" "You do as you're told," interrupted the second. "Don't always have to be told twice. If I want you, I'll send for you." Tammy stood up and made his way, in rather an unsteady fashion, into the berth. I fancy he was glad enough to lie down. "Now then, Jessup," exclaimed the second mate, turning to me, "what's been the cause of all this? Out with it now, smart." I commenced to tell him, but almost directly he put up his hand. "Hold on a minute," he said. "There's the breeze." He jumped up the port ladder and sung out to the chap at the wheel, then down again. "Starboard fore brace," he sung out. He turned to me. "You'll have to finish telling me afterwards," he said. "Aye, aye, sir," I replied, and went to join the other chaps at the braces. As soon as we were braced sharp up on the port tack, he sent some of the watch up to loose the sails. Then he sung out for me. "Go on with your yarn now, Jessup," he said. I told him about the great shadow vessel, and I said something about Tammy. I mean, about my not being sure now whether he had tried to jump overboard. Because, you see, I began to realize that I had seen the shadow. I remembered the stirring of the water above the submerged truck. But the second did not wait, of course, for any theories, but was away like a shot to see for himself. He ran to the side and looked down. I followed and stood beside him. Yet, now that the surface of the water was blurred by the wind, we could see nothing. "It's no good," he remarked after a minute. "You'd better get away from the rail before any of the others see you. Just be taking those halyards aft to the capstan." From then until 8 bells we were hard at work getting the sail upon her, and when at last 8 bells went, I made haste to swallow my breakfast and get asleep. At midday, when we went on deck for the afternoon watch, I ran to the side. But there was no sign of the great shadow ship. All that watch the second mate kept me working at my paunch mat, and Tammy he put on to his sinnet, telling me to keep an eye on the youngster. But the boy was right enough, as I scarcely doubted now, you know, though, a most unusual thing, he hardly opened his lips the whole afternoon. Then at 4 o'clock we went below for tea. At 4 bells, when we came on deck again, I found that the light breeze, which had kept us going during the day, had dropped, and we were only just moving. The sun was low down and the sky clear. Once or twice I glanced across to the horizon. It seemed to me that I caught again that odd quiver in the air that had preceded the coming of the mist. And indeed on 2 separate occasions I saw a thin wisp of haze drive up, apparently out of the sea. This was at some little distance on our port beam. Otherwise all was quiet and peaceful, and though I stared into the water, I could make out no vestige of that great shadow ship down in the sea. It was some little time after 6 bells that the order came for all hands to shorten sail for the night. We took in the royals and the topgallants, and then the 3 courses. It was shortly after this that a rumour went round the ship that there was to be no lookout that night after 8 o'clock. This naturally created a good deal of talk among the men, especially as the yarn went that the forecastle doors were to be shut and fastened as soon as it was dark, and that no one was to be allowed on deck. "Who's going to take the wheel?" I heard Plummer ask. "I suppose they'll have us take 'em as usual," replied one of the men. "One of their officers is bound to be on the poop, so we'll have company." Apart from these remarks, there was a general opinion that, if it were true, it was a sensible act on the part of the skipper. As one of the men said, "It ain't likely that there'll be any of us missin' in the morning if we stays in our bunks all the blessed night." And soon after this, 8 bells went. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 16. The Ghost Pirates. At the moment when 8 bells actually went, I was in the forecastle, talking to 4 of the other watch. Suddenly, away aft, I heard shouting, and then on the deck overhead came the loud thudding of someone pumping with a capstan bar. Straightway I turned and made a run for the port doorway, along with the 4 other men. We rushed out through the doorway onto the deck. It was getting dusk, but that did not hide from me a terrible and extraordinary sight. All along the port rail there was a queer, undulating greyness that moved downwards inboard and spread over the decks. As I looked, I found that I saw more clearly in a most extraordinary way. And suddenly all the moving greyness resolved into hundreds of strange men. In the half-light they looked unreal and impossible, as though there had come upon us the inhabitants of some fantastic dream world. My God, I thought I was mad. They swarmed in upon us in a great wave of murderous, living shadows. From some of the men who must have been going aft for roll call there rose into the evening air a loud, awful shouting. "Aloft!" yelled someone, but as I looked aloft, I saw that the horrible things were swarming there in scores and scores. "Jesus Christ!" shrieked a man's voice, cut short, and my glance dropped from aloft to find 2 of the men who had come out from the forecastle with me, rolling upon the deck. They were 2 indistinguishable masses that writhed here and there across the planks. The brutes fairly covered them. From them came muffled little shrieks and gasps, and there I stood, and with me were the other 2 men. A man darted past me into the forecastle, with 2 grey men on his back, and I heard them kill him. The 2 men by me ran suddenly across the forehatch, and up the starboard ladder onto the forecastle head. Yet, almost in the same instant, I saw several of the grey men disappear up the other ladder. From the forecastle head above, I heard the 2 men commence to shout, and this died away into a loud scuffling. At that, I turned to see whether I could get away. I stared round, hopelessly. And then, with 2 jumps, I was on the pigsty, and from there upon the top of the deck-house. I threw myself flat and waited breathlessly. All at once it seemed to me that it was darker than it had been the previous moment, and I raised my head very cautiously. I saw that the ship was enveloped in great billows of mist, and then, not 6 feet from me, I made out someone lying face downwards. It was Tammy. I felt safer now that we were hidden by the mist, and I crawled to him. He gave a quick gasp of terror when I touched him, but when he saw who it was, he started to sob like a little kid. "Hush," I said. "For God's sake, be quiet." But I need not have troubled, for the shrieks of the men being killed, down on the decks all around us, drowned every other sound. I knelt up and glanced round and then aloft. Overhead I could make out dimly the spars and sails, and now as I looked I saw that the topgallants and royals had been unloosed and were hanging in the buntlines. Almost in the same moment the terrible crying of the poor beggars about the decks ceased, and there succeeded an awful silence, in which I could distinctly hear Tammy sobbing. I reached out and shook him. "Be quiet! Be quiet!" I whispered intensely. "They'll hear us." At my touch and whisper, he struggled to become silent, and then, overhead, I saw the 6 yards being swiftly mastheaded. Scarcely were the sails set when I heard the swish and flick of gaskets being cast adrift on the lower yards, and realized that ghostly things were at work there. For a moment or so there was silence, and I made my way cautiously to the after end of the house, and peered over. Yet, because of the mist, I could see nothing. Then, abruptly, from behind me, came a single wail of sudden pain and terror from Tammy. It ended instantly in a sort of choke. I stood up in the mist and ran back to where I had left the kid, but he had gone. I stood dazed. I felt like shrieking out loud. Above me I heard the flaps of the course being tumbled off the yards. Down upon the decks there were the noises of a multitude working in a weird, inhuman silence. Then came the squeal and rattle of blocks and braces aloft. They were squaring the yards. I remained standing. I watched the yards squared, and then I saw the sails fill suddenly. An instant later, the deck of the house upon which I stood became canted forward. The slope increased, so that I could scarcely stand, and I grabbed at one of the wire winches. I wondered, in a stunned sort of way, what was happening. Almost directly afterwards, from the deck on the port side of the house, there came a sudden, loud, human scream. And immediately, from different parts of the decks, there rose, afresh, some most horrible shouts of agony from odd men. These grew into an intense screaming that shook my heart up, and there came again a noise of desperate, brief fighting. Then a breath of cold wind seemed to play in the mist, and I could see down the slope of the deck. I looked below me, towards the bows. The jibboom was plunged right into the water, and, as I stared, the bows disappeared into the sea. The deck of the house became a wall to me, and I was swinging from the winch, which was now above my head. I watched the ocean lap over the edge of the forecastle head and rush down onto the main deck, roaring into the empty forecastle. And still, all around me, came crying of the lost sailormen. I heard something strike the corner of the house above me, with a dull thud, and then I saw Plummer plunge down into the flood beneath. I remembered that he had been at the wheel. The next instant the water had leapt to my feet. There came a drear chorus of bubbly screams, a roar of waters, and I was going swiftly down into the darkness. I let go of the winch and struck out madly, trying to hold my breath. There was a loud singing in my ears. It grew louder. I opened my mouth. I felt I was dying. And then, thank God, I was at the surface breathing. For the moment I was blinded with the water, and my agony of breathlessness. Then, growing easier, I brushed the water from my eyes, and so, not 300 yards away, I made out a large ship, floating almost motionless. At first I could scarcely believe I saw aright. Then, as I realized that indeed there was yet a chance of living, I started to swim towards you. You know the rest." "And you think—" said the captain interrogatively, and stopped short. "No," replied Jessup, "I don't think. I know. None of us think. It's a gospel fact. People talk about queer things happening at sea, but this isn't one of them. This is one of the real things. You've all seen queer things, perhaps more than I have. It depends. But they don't go down in the log. These kinds of things never do. This one won't. At least, not as it's really happened." He nodded his head slowly and went on, addressing the captain more particularly. "I'll bet," he said deliberately, "that you'll enter it in the logbook something like this: May 18th, latitude south, longitude west, 2 p.m., light winds from the south and east. Sighted a full-rigged ship on the starboard bow. Overhauled her in the first dog-watch. Signaled her, but received no response. During the second dog-watch, she steadily refused to communicate. About 8 bells it was observed that she seemed to be settling by the head, and a minute later she foundered suddenly, bows foremost, with all her crew. Put out a boat and picked up one of the men, an A.B. by the name of Jessup. He was quite unable to give any explanation of the catastrophe. And you two. He made a gesture at the first and second mates. Will probably sign your names to it, and so will I, and perhaps one of your A.B.s. Then when we get home they'll print a report of it in the newspapers, and people will talk about the unseaworthy ships. Maybe some of the experts will talk rot about rivets and defective plates and so forth." He laughed cynically, then he went on. "And, when you come to think of it, there's no one except our own selves will ever know how it happened, really. The shellbacks don't count. They're only beastly, drunken brutes of common sailors, poor devils. No one would think of taking anything they said as anything more than a damned cuffer. Besides, the beggars only tell these things when they're half boozed. They wouldn't then, for fear of being laughed at, only they're not responsible." He broke off and looked round at us. The skipper and the 2 mates nodded their heads in silent assent. Appendix: The Silent Ship. "I am the 3rd mate of the Sangier, the vessel that picked up Jessup, He's asked us to write a short note of what we saw from our side, and sign it. The old man set me on the job, as he says I can put it better than he can. Well, it was in the first dog-watch that we came up with her, the Mort Cestus, I mean. It was in the second dog-watch that it happened. The mate and I were on the poop watching her. You see, we'd signaled her, and she'd not taken any notice, and that seemed queer, as we couldn't have been more than 300 or 400 yards off her port beam, and it was a fine evening, so that we could have almost had a tea-fight if they'd seemed a pleasant crowd. As it was, we called them a set of sulky swine and left it at that, though we still kept our hoist up. All the same, we watched her a lot, and I remembered even then I thought it queer how quiet she was. We couldn't even hear her bell go, and I spoke to the mate about it, and he said he'd been noticing the same thing. Then, about 6 bells, they shortened her right down to topsails. And I can tell you that made us stare more than ever, as anyone can imagine. And I remember we noticed then especially that we couldn't hear a single sound from her, even when the halyards were let go. And, without the glass, I saw their old man singing out something, and we didn't get a sound of it, and we should have been able to hear every word. Then, just before 8 bells, the thing Jessup's told us about happened. Both the mate and the old man said they could see men going up her side a bit indistinct, because it was getting dusk. But the second mate and I half thought we did and half thought we didn't. But there was something queer. We all knew that, and it looked like a sort of moving mist along her side. I know I felt pretty funny, but it wasn't the sort of thing, of course, to be sure and serious about until you were sure. After the mate and the captain had said they saw the men boarding her, we began to hear sounds from her, very queer at first, and rather like a phonograph makes when it's getting up speed. Then the sounds came properly from her, and we heard them shouting and yelling, and, I don't know even now just what I really thought. It was all so queer and mixed. The next thing I remember, there was a thick mist round the ship, and then all the noise was shut off, as if it were all the other side of a door. But we could still see her masts and spars and sails above the misty stuff. And both the captain and the mate said they could see me aloft, and I thought I could, but the second mate wasn't sure. All the same, though, the sails were all loosed in about a minute, it seemed, and the yards mastheaded. We couldn't see the courses above the mist, but Jessup says they were loosed too and sheeted home along the upper sails. Then we saw the yards squared, and I saw the sails fill bang up with wind. And yet, ours were slatting. The next thing was the one that hit me more than anything. Her mast took a cant forward, and then I saw her stern come up out of the mist that was round her. Then, all in an instant, We could hear sounds from the vessel again. And I tell you, the men didn't seem to be shouting, but screaming. Her stern went higher. It was most extraordinary to look at. And then she went plunk down, head foremost, right bang into the mist stuff. It's all right what Jessup says, and when we saw him swimming, I was the one who spotted him, we got out a boat quicker than a windjammer ever got out a boat before, I should think. The captain and the mate and the second and I are all going to sign this. Signed, William Nawston, Master. J.E.G. Adams, First Mate. Ed Brown, Second Mate. Jack T. Evan, Third Mate. The End of The Ghost Pirates by William Hope Hodgson.